A woman, clutching a single worn-out valise, steps off a stagecoach into the freezing mud of a town that isn't even a town. She is Matilda Hale, a mail-order bride sent from Boston to marry a man she's never met. But the man isn't there. Instead, two hulking, bearded figures emerge from the shadows. They grab her arm, their voices like gravel. "You're with us, girl." They drag her toward the dark mountains, and one of them leans in his breath, hot in the freezing air, and delivers a terrifying promise. "You'll satisfy us both." The stagecoach lurched to a halt, its wheels sinking 6 inches into the thick, freezing mud that served as the main street of Solitude Creek, Colorado territory. For Matilda Hale, it felt like the end of the world. And perhaps she thought it was. At 21, Matilda was already an expert in endings, the end of her family's meager savings, the end of her father's life at the textile mill, and the end of her illusions when she was forced into the Charles Street workhouse in Boston. Her escape had been a desperate gamble, a single brief advertisement in the Matrimonial Times from a Mr. Gideon Shaw, a miner, who sought a decent woman for partnership and homemaking in the West. She had nothing left to lose. Now she wasn't so sure. The driver, a leathery man named Pike, spat a brown stream of tobacco onto the ground. "This is it, ma'am. Solitude Creek." Matilda peered out the window. It wasn't a town. It was a wound in the earth, a collection of ramshackle tents, raw timber storefronts, and a single 2-story saloon with a painted sign that just said, "Whiskey." The mountains, jagged and purple with shadow, loomed over the camp like a predator. The air was thin and smelled of pine, cold iron, and unwashed bodies. She clutched her small carpetbag valise. In it were her only possessions, a spare dress, her mother's tarnished locket, and the last 2 letters from Mr. Shaw. His handwriting was neat, his words polite. He promised a comfortable cabin and a new start. "Mr. Shaw was supposed to meet me," Matilda said, her voice barely a whisper. The driver didn't look at her. He was already unhitching the horses. "Folks round here get busy, or they get dead." A cold dread, sharper than the mountain wind, settled over her. She was 1,000 miles from anything she knew a virgin, as the agency had delicately listed her entirely alone. She was property shipped and delivered. She gathered her courage, what little remained, and stepped out. Her thin-soled boots instantly soaked through with icy mud. The few men lingering on the boardwalk, miners with hollow eyes and ragged beards, stopped their conversations. They stared. Not with kindness, but with a raw, assessing hunger that made her skin crawl. She pulled her threadbare shawl tighter. You Miss Hale?" The voice came from the shadows of the livery stable. It was a rumble like rocks grinding together. 2 men stepped forward. They were giants. They were not miners in the way she'd imagined. They were mountain men draped in thick buffalo hides and beaver pelts that smelled ripe and bloody. The first man was older, his hair and beard a wild iron-grey tangle. His eyes, set deep in a weathered face, were the color of a frozen lake. The second man was younger, built just as broad with a dark, brooding silence. A massive hunting knife was strapped to his thigh. Yes, I am Matilda Hale," she stammered. "I'm here to meet Mr. Gideon Shaw." The older man, the one who had spoken, glanced at his companion. It was a look that passed in an instant, but it was filled with something dark. He stepped closer, close enough for her to see the scar that ran from his temple to his jaw. "Name's Jebediah Pike," the older one said. "This here's my brother Barnaby." Barnaby just nodded, his eyes fixed on her. "Mr. Pike, a pleasure," Matilda said, forcing a courtesy that felt absurd. "Do you know where Mr. Shaw is? He is my fiancé." Jebediah Pike looked her up and down, a slow, deliberate appraisal, as if he were judging livestock. Gideon's not here. "Oh," she said, her stomach tightening. Is he at his claim? Will he be back soon?" Jebediah reached out, and before she could flinch, grabbed the handle of her valise. He lifted it as if it weighed nothing. "Gideon's gone. Gone where to Denver? Just gone." Jebediah said, his voice final. He jerked his head toward the mountains. "You're with us now, girl." Panic, cold and sharp, seized Matilda's throat. "No, I am contracted to Mr. Shaw, the matrimonial agency. I have the papers." Barnaby, the silent brother, moved with startling speed. He didn't grab her, but simply flanked her, blocking any potential escape back to the stagecoach. The driver was already gone, disappearing into the saloon. "The papers don't matter," Jebediah said, his voice flat. "The contract's with the claim, Gideon's claim. And that claim, it's ours now." "You can't do this," Matilda whispered, tears welling in her eyes. This isn't right." "Right?" Jebediah let out a short, harsh laugh that wasn't a laugh at all. "Right is what keeps you alive up here, girl. Wrong is what gets you buried before the spring thaw. You're coming." He turned and began walking, his massive form disappearing into the dusk. Barnaby grunted a clear order. "Move." Matilda, Trembling, followed. She was a piece of mail delivered to the wrong address, and the new owners had no intention of returning her to sender. The journey was a nightmare. They didn't take the main road. They took a narrow, winding mule track that climbed straight up the side of the mountain. Jebediah put her on a mule, its back bony, and its fur matted with burrs, and took the lead. Barnaby walked behind his long rifle, resting in the crook of his arm. They didn't speak. The only sounds were the clip-clop of the mule's hooves on rock, the rising shriek of the wind through the pines, and Matilda's own terrified, shallow breaths. Twice the mule slipped, and she nearly pitched over the side of the trail into a canyon of pure blackness. Barnaby's hand would shoot out, grabbing the bridle and steadying the animal with a gruff curse. He saved her, but it didn't feel like rescue. It felt like a man protecting his property from damage. She thought of Gideon Shaw. What kind of man was he? Had he set this up? Had he sold her to these savages? Or had they done something to him? The driver's words echoed in her head. "Folks round here get busy, or they get dead." After what felt like hours, they broke through the tree line onto a high, wind-swept ridge. A cabin stood there silhouetted against a bruised purple sky. It was not the comfortable cabin Gideon had promised. It was a crude box of raw, mud-chinked logs with a stone chimney leaking a thin plume of smoke. Animal skins, dozens of them, were stretched and curing on frames against the outer wall. Jebediah pushed open the heavy plank door. The inside was one large room, lit by a single sputtering tallow candle and the low glow of a fireplace. It was chaos. Tin plates crusted with old food, dusty animal traps, mining tools, and unwashed blankets were strewn everywhere. The air was thick with the smell of wood-smoke stale whiskey and the musky, overpowering odor of the pelts. "Get in," Jebediah ordered. Matilda stumbled inside. Barnaby followed, bolting the thick wooden bar across the door. The sound was horribly final. Where do I sleep?" Matilda asked, her eyes darting around, looking for any sign of another room, a woman's touch, anything from Gideon. Jebediah pointed to a dark corner, separated from the main room by a hanging deer hide. "In there." She pulled back the hide. It was a small, windowless alcove, barely larger than a closet. A narrow cot, its mattress stuffed with lumpy straw, was pushed against the wall. It was a prison cell. "Food's on the table if you want it," Jebediah grunted, gesturing to a half-eaten loaf of dark bread and a hunk of dried meat. "Don't light no extra candles. Wasteful." He and Barnaby sat at the rough-hewn table, pulled out a bottle of whiskey, and began to speak in low, growling tones, not even looking at her. They were arguing, she thought. About what about her? Matilda retreated to the alcove and sat on the lumpy cot, pulling her shawl around her. The reality of her situation crashed down. She was trapped. These men were brutes, animals. They had claimed her just as they'd claimed the cabin. She was their possession, their thing. She tried to pray, but the words wouldn't come. All she could think about was the Charles Street workhouse, the stench of lye, the endless clatter of the laundry, the cruel matrons. She had survived that. She had to survive this. She was not just a trembling virgin. She was Matilda Hale, and she was a survivor. But as the night wore on, and the only sounds were the rising wind and the low, drunken murmuring of the Pike brothers, her resolve began to crack. She heard the clink of the bottle being set down hard, the scrape of a chair. Her heart hammered against her ribs. The hide was pulled back. Jebediah Pike filled the doorway, a massive, terrifying silhouette against the firelight. Barnaby was right behind him, his face dark and unreadable. She scrambled to the back of the cot, pressing herself against the cold log wall. "Please," she whispered. "Please don't." Jebediah looked at her, his frozen lake eyes seeming to pierce the darkness. "We know what you are, girl," he rumbled. "The agency papers come through the assayer's office. We seen 'em. Matilda Hale, 21, of good health, and untouched." Matilda squeezed her eyes shut, tears streaming down her face. This was it. This was the end. "Mr. Shaw, where is he?" she pleaded one last time. "What did you do to him?" Barnaby the Silent One spoke. His voice was a deep bass, and it shocked her. "Gideon's dead." The words hung in the air. "Dead." "He's dead, girl," Jebediah repeated, stepping fully into the alcove. He was so close she could smell the whiskey on his breath. "He took a tumble down the main shaft a week ago. Cave-in. But the contract was for the claim," Jebediah said, his voice dropping. "He owed us. He owed us plenty. His debt is ours now. And you?" He looked at Barnaby, then back at her. "You're part of the payment." "Payment for what?" she sobbed. Jebediah's eyes narrowed. He looked at Barnaby, who gave a single curt nod. "She'll have to do." Jebediah grunted. "She's scrawny, but she'll do." He turned his gaze back to Matilda, who was now shaking so violently she could barely breathe. He leaned down his face just inches from hers. "You're going to be very busy, girl." He said the words a terrifying, quiet promise. "You'll satisfy us both." Matilda didn't sleep. She sat bolted upright on the straw mattress, her entire body locked in a state of paralyzing terror. She waited for the hide to be pulled back again, for one of them or both to return. But they didn't. The low murmuring on the other side of the deer hide continued, punctuated by the occasional scrape of the bottle on the table. Then, one by one, she heard the heavy thud of boots hitting the floor and the groan of the cots they must have slept in. Finally, silence. But not peace. Every creak of the cabin, every howl of the wind was a new threat. She was property, a scrawny payment for a debt. The line, "You'll satisfy us both," played over and over in her mind, a sickening promise of her fate. She was no longer a person. She was a resource to be consumed. She must have drifted into a state of exhausted shock because the next thing she knew, a sliver of grey light was cutting through a crack in the cabin wall. It was morning. A heavy fist pounded on the log wall next to her alcove. "Get up, girl." It was Jebediah, her stomach twisted. This was it. The time had come. She forced her frozen limbs to move. She stood, her hands shaking. She hadn't even taken off her dress or boots. She took a deep breath, trying to find that kernel of strength from the workhouse. She would not beg. She would not cry. She would face this. She pulled back the hide and stepped into the main room. The sight that greeted her was not what she expected. The fire was roaring. Barnaby was at the table, a large whetstone in his hands, rhythmically sharpening his massive hunting knife. Shing, shing, shing. The sound set her teeth on edge. Jebediah was standing by the fireplace, holding a ledger book. He tossed it onto the table. It landed with a heavy thump. "Can you read?" he demanded. Matilda blinked, confused. "What?" "Read and write, and cipher," he said impatiently. "The agency papers said, educated at a parish school. Is it true?" "Yes," she said, her voice small. "I can read and write. And I am good with numbers. My father taught me." Jebediah grunted. "Good." Gideon wasn't. He pointed, not at his cot, not at his brother. He pointed at the fireplace, where a large, soot-blackened pot hung over the flames boiling water. Next to it was a sack of oats, a slab of salt pork, and a tin of coffee. "He couldn't cipher," Jebediah continued, "and he couldn't cook. His biscuits were hard as quartz. His coffee was mud. And his books," he tapped the ledger, "they're a mess, a pig's breakfast." Matilda just stared, her mind unable to process the shift. Jebediah sighed a sound of pure exasperation and scrubbed his hand through his grizzled hair. "Look, girl. Matilda. Gideon was our brother." Matilda's jaw dropped. Your brother. "Our younger brother," Barnaby said, not looking up from his knife. "The smart one. The one who was supposed to make us all rich. He came out here 3 years ago." Jebediah picked up the story. "Found this claim. A good one. Real good. A vein of silver so thick you can see it plain." He kicked at a bucket of ore by the door. "He wrote to us back in Missouri. Told us to come. Said he needed partners. Needed family. So we came." Barnaby said, the knife seeming to grow sharper under his hand. "Sold our farm. Put every cent we had into this hole in the ground. Gideon, he was a fine miner." Jebediah said, his voice softening with a flicker of grief. "But he was a fool for everything else. He liked the saloon. He liked the cards. And he liked to spend money he didn't have." He opened the ledger. The pages were a disaster of chicken scratch numbers, crossed out lines and wine stains. He was drowning in debt. To the Assayer, to the general store in town, to others. Matilda finally understood. "The debt. He owed you. He owed us our farm," Barnaby said, his voice flat and cold. "He owed us everything," Jebediah continued. He thought a wife would settle him, make him respectable. He sent for you, paid the agency with money he'd borrowed against our share of the claim. And then he died," Matilda whispered, looking at the 2 men. "They weren't kidnappers. They were family. Mourning." "A week ago," Jebediah confirmed. "The cave-in. Looked like the timbering gave out. We buried him ourselves up on the ridge." A wave of relief, so profound it made her dizzy, washed over Matilda. It was followed by a sharp, confusing guilt. Her fiancé was dead. She should be sad. But all she felt was the release of a terrible, terrible fear. "But last night," she stammered, you said I would satisfy us both." Jebediah had the decency to look sheepish. He rubbed the back of his neck. "Aye. Well, we were tired, and angry, and half-drunk." "What he means," Barnaby cut in, finally setting the knife down, "is that we're stuck. We got a claim that needs working. We got debts that need paying. And we got a winter coming on. We're 2 men who know how to dig rock and shoot game. We don't know how to run a business. And we sure as hell don't know how to cook." He pointed at the boiling pot, then at the ledger. "Gideon's contract with you is void. You're free to go. The stage leaves in 2 days. We can give you enough to get to Denver. After that, you're on your own." Jebediah held up a hand. "Or you stay." Matilda looked at him. "Stay," Jebediah said. As a partner. Not a bride. We need someone to run these books, to manage the supplies, to make this place livable, to cook." He gestured to the kitchen, then to the ledger. "That's us both, the stomach and the wallet. That's the satisfaction we need. You do that, you keep this claim afloat, and you'll get a full 1/3 share. Same as us." Matilda stared at them. The 2 giant, terrifying mountain men. They hadn't wanted her body. They had wanted an accountant and a chef. She looked at the filthy cabin. She looked at the disastrous ledger. She thought of the workhouse. She thought of being alone in Denver with no money and no prospects. She walked over to the fireplace. She picked up a wooden spoon. She looked in the pot of boiling water, then at the sack of oats. "First." Matilda Hale said, her voice clear and steady for the first time since she'd left Boston. "We're going to have a proper breakfast. Then you're going to show me the mine. And you," she pointed at Barnaby, "are going to scrub that table." Barnaby Pike looked at his brother. He looked at the tiny woman pointing a spoon at him. A slow, faint smile cracked his bearded face. He picked up the bucket of lye soap. The next few weeks were the hardest of Matilda's life, and strangely, the most rewarding. The Pike brothers were not monsters. They were simply men as raw and unrefined as the mountains they lived in. They were gruff, suspicious of her eastern ways, and possessed of appetites she could scarcely believe. But they were also fair. Matilda, in turn, was a revelation to them. She rose before dawn, her first act to boil water and scrub. Within 3 days, the cabin was cleaner than it had been since Gideon built it. The floors were swept. The tin plates scoured, the greasy animal pelts moved to a separate curing shed. She made them biscuits that, while not soft, were at least edible, and her coffee, brewed with a precious bitto of chicory she'd found in Gideon's supplies, was drinkable, which from Jebediah was the highest of compliments. But her real work was the ledger. After 2 days of poring over Gideon's frantic scrawls, she had a clear and terrifying picture. "You're not in debt," she told them one night by the fire. "You're on the verge of ruin. Gideon had been a fool. He had sold Silver Future's promises of ore. He hadn't even dug yet, at a fraction of their value, all for quick cash to gamble at the saloon. He owed the general store owner, Mr. Silas Finch, who she noted was not on the user's exclusion list, over $200 for whiskey and cigars. But the biggest debt, the one that made her blood run cold, was a service fee of $500 to one man. Sheriff Emmett Reed. "The sheriff?" Matilda asked, looking up from the book. "Why did Gideon owe the sheriff $500? Jebediah and Barnaby exchanged a look. "Reed handles things," Jebediah said slowly. He keeps the other claim jumpers away. He makes sure the assay reports are favorable. He's the law and he's the taxman all in one." "He's a thief," Barnaby growled, spitting into the fire. "He's a necessary thief," Jebediah corrected. "Solitude Creek ain't Denver. A man like Reed, he's what passes for order. Gideon paid him for protection." "And now Gideon is dead," Matilda said softly, "and the protection money is due." A knock echoed on the cabin door. It was so sudden, so sharp, that all 3 of them froze. No one came up to the Pike claim, ever. Barnaby grabbed his rifle from the wall. Jebediah moved to stand in front of Matilda. "Who is it?" Jeb barked. Why, it's just the law, Jebediah. A smooth, cultured voice called from outside, a voice that was dangerously out of place in the raw mountains. Paying my respects to the bereaved, and of course to the new arrangement. Jebediah slowly unbarred the door. Sheriff Emmett Reed was everything the Pike brothers were not. He was of average height, slender and impeccably dressed. His black frock coat was brushed, his boots polished to a high shine, and his silver badge glittered in the lamplight. He was handsome, with dark, neatly combed hair and a charming smile. But his eyes, Matilda thought, were flat and cold, the eyes of a snake. "Gentlemen," Reed said, stepping inside and removing his hat. He glanced around the newly cleaned cabin, his eyebrows rising in surprise. My, you've tidied up." His gaze landed on Matilda. It was not the hungry, animalistic stare of the miners in town. It was something worse. It was the look of a collector, a man appraising a fine new painting he intended to own. "And this must be the lady," he said, his voice dropping to a silken purr. "Miss Matilda Hale. I saw the agency papers when they arrived. Boston's loss is truly Solitude Creek's gain." He stepped toward her. "Emmett Reed, sheriff of this territory, my deepest condolences for your loss, ma'am. Gideon was a friend." "Thank you, Sheriff," Matilda said, forcing her voice to remain level. She did not like this man. She did not like him at all. "A tragedy, his passing," Reed said, circling the table, his fingers trailing over the open ledger. "A terrible, clumsy accident. He was always so careless with his timbering." He stopped, his finger landing on his own name in the book. "And just as careless with his finances, it seems. We're aware of the debts," Jebediah said, his voice a low rumble. "We'll be honoring them." "Will you?" Reed smiled, though it didn't reach his cold eyes. "That is good to hear. Because that $500, it's due on the 1st of the month, in 3 days. 3 days, Jebediah exploded. "We ain't even cleared the shaft. That's impossible." "The 1st of the month," Reed repeated, his voice hardening. "Or I will be forced to place a lien on the claim. Seize it for non-payment. According to the territorial charter, of course. You'd throw us off our own claim, off our brother's claim." Barnaby's hand tightened on his rifle. Reed's smile vanished. "Watch your tone, Mr. Pike. I am the law, and the law says debts must be paid." He looked back at Matilda. "It's a harsh world out here, Miss Hale. A delicate flower like you. Well, you're stuck with these two brutes. A real shame. Gideon, for all his faults, at least knew how to treat a lady." He moved to the door. "Perhaps you find yourself in need of alternative accommodations. My office has a very comfortable, very safe room attached. You would be, well, protected." The offer hung in the air, thick and poisoned. He wasn't just threatening their mine, he was threatening her. "I am fine where I am, Sheriff," Matilda said, lifting her chin. "These men are my partners. We will see you in 3 days, with the money." Reed looked genuinely surprised. He studied her for a long moment, then a slow, appreciative smile returned. "Partners? How progressive." He tipped his hat. "I look forward to it. Good evening, Miss Hale, gentlemen." He left, closing the door behind him. The three of them stood in silence. 3 days, Jebediah finally whispered, slumping into a chair. "He knows we can't pull 500 out of that shaft in 3 days, not even with dynamite." "He doesn't want the money," Barnaby said, barring the door. "No," Matilda said, her eyes fixed on the ledger. "He doesn't. He wants the mine, and he wants me." She looked at the 2 giant men who had terrified her just weeks before. Now they were the only thing standing between her and a man far more dangerous than any mountain savage. "Well," she said, pulling the ledger toward her and opening a fresh page. He can't have either. Get your picks. You have 3 days to dig. I have 3 days to think. The next 72 hours were a blur of desperation. Jebediah and Barnaby worked in the mine shaft until their hands were raw, using precious dynamite to blast the silver-veined quartz, working by the dim light of lanterns until they nearly collapsed from exhaustion. Matilda ran the operation like a drill sergeant. She cooked high-energy meals, sharpened their tools on the grindstone, and slept in 2-hour increments, her mind racing. They were hauling up good ore, rich and heavy, but it wasn't enough. Not nearly. "It's no use, Tilda," Jebediah said, on the morning of the 3rd day, his voice hoarse. He collapsed at the table, his face black with soot and sweat. "We got maybe 250 worth of ore in that bucket. We're short." Matilda looked at the numbers she'd been scribbling. She'd gone through every line of Gideon's expenses. "We're not just short, Jeb. We're being strangled." She pointed to the ledger. "I sent Barnaby into town yesterday for more blasting powder and flour. You know what Mr. Finch at the general store told him. What? Our credit is cut off." Matilda said, her voice tight with anger. "Gideon's debt," he said. "Paid in full or no more supplies. And the assayer, Mr. Jones, he lost our last deposit slip. He says he has no record of the 30 pounds of ore we gave him last week." Jebediah slammed his fist on the table. "Reed, that bastard is squeezing us from every side. He's told the whole town not to trade with us." "He's isolating us," Matilda agreed. "He's not just foreclosing, he's starving us out. When he comes up here today, he wants us broken. He wants us with nothing." Barnaby, who had been cleaning his rifle by the fire, spoke without looking up. "We could just end it. One shot. Up here no one would find him till spring." "No," Matilda said, her voice sharp. "No. That's what he would do. If we do that, we're no better than he is. We lose the law. We lose everything. We have to beat him, Barnaby. We have to beat him with something." "We got nothing." Jebediah put his head in his hands. "It's over. He's won." Matilda stared at the wall at the chaos of Gideon's old life that she hadn't yet sorted. A stack of his personal effects sat in a wooden crate, cheap dime novels, a broken shaving mirror, and his old mud-caked canvas coat. She was not a victim. She was not a workhouse girl. She was a partner. "No," she said, standing up. "He hasn't. Not yet." She walked to the crate and began to rifle through it, her mind grasping at straws. There had to be something, some clue, some thing that Gideon had missed. She plunged her hand into the pocket of the heavy coat. Her fingers brushed against paper. It wasn't a letter, it was a receipt, tucked deep in the lining as if hidden in a hurry. It was from the general store, dated 2 weeks ago, just 1 day before Gideon's accidental cave-in. It was for 2 crates of Samsonite Mar 3 blasting powder, a massive, expensive order, enough to clear a whole new shaft. But that wasn't the part that made her stop breathing. At the bottom, in Mr. Finch's familiar handwriting, was a note, "To be picked up by E. Reed, paid in full from G. Shaw's account." Matilda's blood ran ice-cold. She read it again and again. "Matilda, what is it?" Jebediah asked, looking at her pale face. "Jeb, Barnaby," she said, her voice a shaking whisper. "Gideon's cave-in. It wasn't an accident." She held out the receipt. Why would Sheriff Reed be picking up 2 crates of dynamite, paid for by Gideon the day before Gideon died in a cave-in? The 2 brothers stared at the paper. The color drained from Jebediah's face. Barnaby stood up, the rifle in his hand, seeming to become part of his arm. That son of a bitch," Jebediah whispered. "He didn't just fall. He was murdered. He was..." Matilda said, the terrible puzzle pieces snapping into place. Reed wanted the mine. He probably pressured Gideon, who refused. So Reed... He didn't wait for Gideon to default. He removed him. He used Gideon's own money to buy the dynamite, set the charge, and buried him. He murdered your brother, knowing the debt would transfer to the claim. He thought he was foreclosing on a dead man's debt. He never counted on us. That's why he was so surprised to see us, Barnaby growled. He thought Gideon was alone. And that's why he wants me, Matilda added, to silence me, to own the last piece of Gideon's property. A shadow fell across the doorway. All three looked up. Sheriff Emmett Reed was standing on their porch, his hand resting casually on the butt of his holstered pistol. He was smiling. "Noon, gentlemen," he said, his voice cheerful. "I've come to collect, or should I say, to claim." The noon sun was high and cold, casting sharp, unforgiving shadows across the ridge. Inside the cabin, the receipt, that small, damning piece of paper, felt as heavy as a bar of silver in Matilda's hand. The air was electric brittle with a terrible shared understanding. Gideon hadn't just been careless. He had been executed. And as if summoned by the accusation itself, a shadow fell across the open doorway. Sheriff Emmett Reed was standing on their porch, his hand resting casually on the butt of his holstered pistol. He was smiling, a picture of smug, civilized authority. He hadn't even bothered to knock. He simply stood there, letting his presence soak into the room. "Noon, gentlemen," he said, his voice cheerful, almost musical. He took a theatrical look at a pocket watch, then snapped it shut. "Punctuality is a virtue, is it not, I've come to collect?" His gaze slid past the two brothers, landing on Matilda with a proprietary gleam. "Or should I say, to claim?" Jebediah rose slowly from his chair. Every muscle in his massive frame was coiled. He was a bear rising from hibernation, slow but radiating lethal intent. His voice was a low, subterranean rumble. "Get off our land." Reed chuckled, a dry, condescending sound. "Your land a common misconception." He produced a folded document from his immaculate frock coat. He unfolded it with a crisp snap. "Writ of seizure signed just this morning by Judge Peterson in Denver, based on my sworn affidavit of your default." He held it up for them to see the official seal. "This claim, it's mine, its cabin, and..." His eyes lingered on Matilda again. "All its contents are hereby forfeit to the territory of Colorado, to be administered by me." He was savoring this. The power, the complete and total victory. "You murdered him." The words were not a shout. They were spoken in Barnaby's deep, flat bass, a statement of fact that cut through Reed's performance like a razor. He hadn't moved from the fireplace, his rifle still held loosely at his side, pointed at the floor. Reed's smile twitched. The music in his voice was gone, replaced by a cold flatness. "I'll beg your pardon. Gideon Bow," Barnaby said, his dark eyes fixed on the sheriff. "You killed him, blew the shaft on top of him. You murdered our brother." Reed's mask of civility cracked. His face hardened. That's a vicious accusation, Mr. Pike. A dangerous one. A man could get in a lot of trouble for slandering the law. You're upset, I understand. You've lost your livelihood. But don't make it worse. It's not slander when it's the truth, Matilda said. Her voice, though it trembled, was clear and sharp. She stepped forward, moving from the shadow of the alcove into the light. She was no longer just a cook, just a housekeeper. She was a partner. She was the one who held the weapon. "We have proof," she said. Reed's eyes darted to her. He had dismissed her, seen her as nothing more than a potential bonus, a delicate flower to be plucked after the real business was done. He had never in all his calculations factored in her mind. his gaze locked onto the small, crumpled piece of paper she held up in her shaking hand. He didn't need to read it. He knew exactly what it was. His face, for one horrifying second, was stripped bare. Matilda saw it all, not just recognition, but the cold, stark terror of a man whose perfect crime had just unraveled in the hand of a scrawny, mail-order bride. His entire plan, his future, his fortune, all of it was balanced on that flimsy piece of paper. "You," he whispered, his composure shattering. "You should have stayed in the kitchen, girl." He dropped the foreclosure notice. His hand was a blur, a black streak moving to the polished leather holster at his hip. He was fast. He was a professional, but he wasn't faster than a brother's rage. Jebediah, fueled by a week of grief and a lifetime of protective fury, did not wait for the gun to clear the holster. He crossed the room in one great roaring leap, a 250-pound avalanche of vengeance. He hit Reed like a grizzly bear, not with a fist, but with his entire body. "Murderer!" he bellowed. The impact was brutal. The two men crashed backward through the cabin doorway, tumbling off the porch and into the thick freezing mud. Reed's pistol flew from his grasp, arcing through the air and landing yards away, half buried in the grime. "Barnaby, the paper!" Matilda screamed, stuffing the precious receipt deep into her dress pocket. "Don't let him get it!" Reed was slick and fast, a snake in the mud. He kneed Jeb hard in the groin, rolled free, and scrambled on all fours, his polished boots slipping desperate to reach his gun. Barnaby lunged, not for the gun, but for Reed, tackling him low around the waist. The three men became a chaotic, grunting, punching mass. It wasn't a fight. It was a desperate, primal brawl. Fists landed with wet, sickening thuds. Curses and shouts of "You killed him" were lost in grunts of exertion. It was then that Matilda heard it, the thunder of hooves, fast and hard, coming up the trail. "Jeb, the deputies!" she shrieked, her heart seizing with a new, cold dread. Reed had brought backup. He had planned for this. The warning cut through Jebediah's rage. He broke free of the brawl, his face a mask of blood and mud. He saw the two mounted men, not 50 yards away, their rifles already unslung. He was unarmed. Reed was scrambling for his pistol. Barnaby was trying to hold him back. Jeb did the only thing he could. He grabbed the one tool that was always at hand, a heavy, sharp-pointed mining pickaxe leaning against the cabin wall. He raised it high, a terrifying, primitive silhouette against the bright sky. "You killed my brother!" he roared, ready to bring it down. "No!" Matilda screamed, running onto the porch. "Jeb, don't. That's what he wants. They'll see you kill him. They'll hang you." Her words were a lifeline, a sliver of reason in his red-hot fury. He froze, the pick held high, his chest heaving. It was the opening Reed needed. He kicked Barnaby square in the face, a vicious, boot-heeled blow that sent him reeling back. Reed lunged his hand, closing around the muddy grip of his pistol. In one fluid motion, he was on his feet, cocking the hammer and aiming it straight at the unarmed Jebediah. The two deputies reined in their horses, their rifles leveled, not at Reed, but at Jeb. "Drop the pick! Pike!" The first deputy yelled, his face grim. "Drop it now! He murdered our brother!" Jebediah roared, his voice cracking with anguish. "He killed Gideon." "He's lying, boys!" Reed shouted, his chest heaving, as he wiped blood and mud from his lip with his sleeve. "They're desperate. They're jumping the claim. They attacked me when I tried to serve the writ. It's self-defense." The deputies looked confused. Their guns remained trained on Jeb. He was the one holding the pick. Reed was the sheriff. Reed was the law. The story on its face was simple. No. The word was quiet, but it cut through the standoff. Matilda Hale walked down the cabin steps. She deliberately, calmly walked past Jebediah's right arm and past the heavy, threatening pick. She walked into the open space, into the mud, and stood directly between Jebediah's desperate fury and Emmett Reed's loaded gun. "Matilda, get back!" Jeb yelled, his voice frantic. "Shut up, you!" Reed snarled, his eyes wild. He couldn't believe her audacity. He shifted the pistol's aim, centering it on her chest. She didn't flinch. She looked not at Reed, but at the two deputies speaking to them, and to the clear, cold mountain air. "He's the liar," she said, her voice ringing with a strength she didn't know she possessed. "Sheriff Emmett Reed murdered Gideon Shaw. He did it to steal this mine." "She's crazy," Reed yelled, his hand tightening on the pistol. She's his woman. She'll say anything. She's an accomplice." "Am I?" Matilda shot back her gaze, never leaving the deputies. "Then ask him. Don't take my word for it. Ride back to town. Ask Mr. Silas Finch at the general store. He's a God-fearing man. Ask him who picked up 2 crates of Samsonite Nutter 3 dynamite on October 10th. Ask him whose account paid for it." She finally turned her eyes to Reed, her gaze as cold and hard as iron. "And then ask him why Gideon Shaw died in a dynamite cave-in the very next day." She tapped her dress pocket. "I have the receipt." The deputies wavered. This was not a simple story anymore. This was specific. This had names. This had evidence. They all knew Silas Finch. They knew him to be an honest, if nervous, man. Reed's face was white. He was trapped. The entire intricate plot was collapsing, brought down by a slip of paper and a woman who knew how to read it. "Put the gun down, Sheriff," the first deputy said, his voice low and uncertain. His rifle was no longer aimed at Jeb, but at a point somewhere between Reed and the ground. Let's just all ride to town. We can talk to Finch. We can sort this." Reed looked at the deputies, his eyes darting. He saw their doubt. He looked at Barnaby, clutching his bleeding face, struggling to his feet. He looked at Jeb, still holding the pick, shaking with the desire to use it. And then he looked at Matilda, the small, trembling woman who had brought him down. He knew it was over. Finch would talk. The whole conspiracy would unravel. He would be ruined. He would hang. A cornered animal has no options. It only has rage. With a scream of pure animalistic spite, he turned the gun fast and final on the one person who had caused it all. He aimed it squarely at Matilda's heart. "You!" he snarled. A single shot exploded across the ridge. It was deafeningly loud, louder than Reed's pistol. Matilda flinched, her eyes squeezing shut, but she felt no pain. She opened her eyes. Emmett Reed stood frozen for a long second. His eyes were wide with a look of profound terminal surprise. A dark crimson flower bloomed on the front of his pristine white shirt, spreading rapidly. He looked down at it, confused. He opened his mouth, but only a wet gurgle came out. Then he crumpled to the ground, his pistol firing harmlessly into the mud as he fell. Jebediah, Barnaby, and Matilda stared, stunned, into absolute silence. The deputies looked wildly around their rifles, up searching for the shooter. "You can lower your weapons, boys." The voice was calm, deep, and carried an authority that dwarfed Reed's. A 4th man rode up, not from the trail, but from a stand of aspen trees to the west. He was tall, wearing a long, mud-splattered duster, his face grim and weathered. A smoking Colt was still in his hand. He holstered it with a practiced fluid motion and dismounted his boots, landing softly in the mud. He walked past the stunned deputies, stopping to nudge Reed's body with his boot. He drew on an unarmed woman. The stranger said, his voice flat. "That's not how we do things in Colorado." Who in the hell are you?" Jebediah managed, finally, painfully lowering the pick. The man looked up his eyes, seeming to take in the entire scene in one cold glance. He pushed back his duster, revealing a tarnished silver badge pinned to his vest. It was not a local sheriff's star. "Name's Johnson," the man said. "U.S. Marshal. Got into town last night. Heard some rumors about Sheriff Reed's bookkeeping and his sudden interest in mining." He looked directly at Matilda, his gaze sharp. "Looks like the rumors were true." He nodded toward the receipt in her pocket. "I have a feeling, ma'am, that you have a story I need to hear." The aftermath on the ridge was a scene of stunned, quiet chaos. The deputy, his face pale and his hands shaking, stammered apologies as he helped Barnaby, who was pressing a rag to the bleeding gash on his face. Marshal Johnson moved with a cold, quiet efficiency, his presence a stark, stabilizing contrast to the violent corruption he had just ended. Reed's body lay in the mud, a grim testament to the law's sudden and final correction. "Ma'am," Johnson said, his voice quiet but firm, turning to Matilda. She was still standing on the porch, her hands clenched so tightly her knuckles were white. "I need your statement." Matilda took a steadying breath, the adrenaline beginning to fade, leaving a bone-deep tremor in its wake. She met his gaze. She did not weep. She did not fall into hysterics. With a cold, clear anger, she recounted everything. She told him of her arrival, the Pike brothers' claim on her, the revelation of Gideon's death, and the discovery of the disastrous ledgers. And then she told him of the squeeze, the cut credit, the lost assay report, and finally of the receipt. She pulled the crumpled paper from her dress and handed it to him, not as a victim, but as a witness presenting an indictment. Marshal Johnson listened, his face impassive, as she laid out the whole story. He looked at the receipt, then at the two massive, battered Pike brothers, who stood watching their fury replaced by a profound, weary shock. "This paper," the marshal said, his voice flat, "is a hanging, or it would have been." He tucked it into his own pocket. "His deputies are just hired muscle. Finch and Jones, they're just scared. Let's see how brave they are when they're not hiding behind a dead man's badge." Johnson took Jebediah and Barnaby with him to town, leaving the now very apologetic deputy to guard the cabin and, more importantly, to guard her. By sunset, Solitude Creek was a town turned inside out. The dam of fear Reed had built for months burst. Silas Finch, the store owner, when faced with a U.S. Marshal and the news of Reed's death, confessed immediately. He wept with relief, admitting Reed had persuaded him to cut off the Pikes' credit and to provide the dynamite, all under threat of having his own business burn to the ground. The assayer, Mr. Jones, in a fit of panic, suddenly found the Pikes' lost deposit slip and admitted to doctoring their reports on Reed's orders. It turned out Reed's corruption ran deeper than anyone knew. He'd been extorting every major claim in the territory, bleeding the miners dry. Gideon Shaw wasn't his first victim, just the first one whose partners had the courage and the bookkeeping to fight back. It was full dark when Matilda heard the heavy, familiar tread of their boots on the porch. She unbarred the door, her heart in her throat. They were battered. Jebediah's left eye was swollen shut, and he walked with a limp. Barnaby's face was a map of fresh cuts and dark bruises, stitched up poorly by the town doctor. But they were different. The desperate, hunted look that had haunted them since her arrival was gone. They looked for the first time at peace. Jebediah looked at her, not as a scrawny girl or a thing to be managed, but as an equal. "It's done, Tilda," he said, his voice rough. He slumped into a chair, the tension leaving his massive frame all at once. Finch confessed. Jones, too. The whole rotten conspiracy. The marshals impounded all of Reed's assets. He found nearly $10,000 in a safe in Reed's office. Our money. Other miners' money. Barnaby just nodded, leaning his rifle against the wall. But he met her gaze. In his eyes she saw something new, profound, undeniable respect. The three of them sat at the scrubbed table in the firelight. A long silence settled, but it wasn't the terrified silence of her first night. It was the quiet of an ending, and the profound, uncertain quiet of a new beginning. Jebediah cleared his throat, a sound like gravel. Well, Tilda, the marshal, he went through the new books. Your books. With Reed gone and the assay reports corrected. That third share, he struggled for the word. It's a fortune. More money than you'll ever see in Boston. He leaned forward, his hands on his knees. You're free to go. We mean it. You can take the stage to Denver tomorrow, or San Francisco. Be a grand lady. Buy silks. You've earned it. You saved us. Barnaby nodded, his eyes fixed on the fire. You done right by us. By Gideon. You don't owe us nothing else. We ain't your jailers. Matilda looked at the two massive, battered men. They had saved her life, and she had saved theirs. They weren't the brutes she had feared. They were her family. She thought of the Charles Street workhouse of the cold, judgmental society of Boston, where she would be a rich spinster, a curiosity, a woman with a story, but no place. Here in this raw, savage, beautiful place, she was more. She was essential. She let the silence stretch, savoring the first real choice she had ever had in her life. Then she smiled. And who, she asked, her voice soft, would cook you your breakfast? Jebediah looked up, confused. What? And more importantly, she continued, her voice gaining the steel they both knew so well. Who would keep you two fools from being cheated by the next sheriff? Jebediah stared. Barnaby stared. Then a slow, deep chuckle started in Jebediah's chest, a rusty, unused sound of pure, unburdened relief. It turned into a full-throated laugh, and even Barnaby cracked a rare, deep smile. So you're staying? Jebediah asked, as if he couldn't believe it. Matilda stood and picked up the kettle. I am a partner, and this partnership is just getting started. The marshal said the claim is ours free and clear. That means we have digging to do, and I have books to balance. She turned the firelight, catching the strength in her eyes. Now wash up. Dinner's almost ready. Matilda Hale never did marry. She never had to. The Pike and Hale silver claim became the most prosperous and, more importantly, the fairest operation in the territory. Miners from other claims came to her to mediate disputes because they knew the woman ran the books, and the books were honest. She became known in time as the Silver Queen of Solitude Creek. The trembling virgin mail-order bride was gone. In her place stood a woman who had faced down savages and found they were her protectors, who had faced down the law and found he was the savage. She had come seeking a husband, but had found something far, far better. She had found a home. In the end, Matilda Hale wasn't satisfied by what the mountain men wanted from her. She was defined by it. They didn't want a servant. They wanted a partner. They didn't want her body. They wanted her brain and her courage. This story isn't just about a woman surviving the Wild West. It's about a woman taming it, not with a gun, but with a ledger book and a backbone of steel. The satisfaction wasn't what she feared, it was what she earned respect. If this story of justice and resilience gripped your heart, please don't keep it to yourself. These stories are a reminder that the real monsters often wear a badge, and the real heroes are the ones brave enough to do the right thing, even when they're trembling. Hit that like button, share this story with someone who needs a reminder of what real strength looks like, and be sure to subscribe for more true life dramas. Your support keeps these histories alive. Thank you for listening.